All right, then. An important topic for us today. That's better. An important topic for us today, actually, even better. Oh, no, it's light. It's how it looks. It's dark. It's light. It's better with that one on. Does he have a point in doing this? Actually, I do, sort of. What I want to talk about today is consciousness and sort of what consciousness is. Now, we're doing this in our context of philosophy of mind class, and we're looking at the metaphysics of the mind-body relationship. So the first thing we always want to do is understand where there might be a kind of metaphysical problem. Again, that's going to be when we have properties, and sometimes the entities that have the properties that seem like they're non-physical things. And we saw in the case of mental representation, and in the case of rationality, which in my view is really a case of the metaphysics of mathematics, we saw a couple of cases where our way of thinking about psychological words seems to involve us in something that's not entirely physical. That's called intentionality, belief, desire, psychology. And as I say, we've got a couple of videos on that. Today, we're talking about consciousness, which is a different kind of problem, a different kind of apparent property, in this case, phenomenal property that doesn't seem to be a physical property. So we're going to look at that. And I am going to offer sort of my own opinion about it, but really the main purpose of this video is to introduce you to the problem of consciousness in terms of sort of what it is. So let me just cue up the slides here. Our handy dandy opening slide. Well, no, here we go. And it is indeed an ancient problem. It's really interesting the way the ancient Greeks looked at what we would call consciousness. It's subtle. You have to look at it. They are really impressed by the idea that there's sort of a spirit animating this body that stands before you. It's really kind of freaky the way that they think about it. But in any event, the idea that this was something, of course, I mean, the whole tradition of mind-body dualism or of soul-body dualism, the whole tradition of immaterial parts of a person that are real parts of the person, even though they're not parts of the body. And that's going to tie into this notion, some of the intuitions that we have about consciousness. What I want to show you today, though, is really specifically how we might motivate consciousness as a problem for the kind of philosophy that we've been doing here, which isn't what everybody has to do. It's just what we're doing here. So first of all, what is consciousness? And consciousness gets used in a couple of different ways. So qualitative experience. Let me step out for a second and talk about that. Qualitative experience. What is that? It's tasting things, touching things, smelling things, seeing things, hearing things. When you're listening to the music, that's largely a qualitative experience. Tasting something is a qualitative experience. Think of the taste of the strawberry versus you're thinking, oh, that's a strawberry, right? Like maybe you have a bowl of fruit salad and you just stick your fork into it. You're not sure what the fruit's going to be. And you put one in your mouth and you say, oh, it's strawberry. Okay, fine. You identified, you brought it under the concept of strawberry. But think about not that, but rather just the taste, purely the taste. Or looking at a surface, say looking at a blue surface. Just think about that experience of seeing blue. Or, my favorite one, I think, as I say on the slide, is thinking about how your feet feel. So, you have an idea about cheese, like, oh, I just love a bit of Stilton grommet, but there's the name Stilton or the concept of the Stilton cheese. But then, you smell. The smell isn't about the Stilton cheese. The Stilton cheese is causing you to have this sensory experience that you're having. And that's a different thing. Okay. We're just trying to I find with consciousness and the problem of consciousness, the problem of phenomenal properties, that it is fairly abstract. And so people, and some people just have a mind for abstraction. Some people struggle more with abstractions, just another one cognitive skill out of many. But so I sort of circle around it a while and make sure we all understand what's being talked about. So again, right now your feet feel like something. Feel your feet right now. No, I'm not. All right, so now that way that they feel, you're having that's your phenomenal experience in your body right now. So you can think of, and I'll get back to this later in the presentation today, you can think about two sets of psychological words. You've got the larger psychological vocabulary, and then you've got the vocabulary of belief, desire, hope, fear. Remember, those are all words that seem to advert to some kind of content, a belief that something, a fear of something, and so on. And then you've got these phenomenal vocabulary, the phenomenal vocabulary of blue, green, taste, lemon, taste, textures. So it looks like psychological vocabulary then breaks down into two sub-vocabularies, the intentional vocabulary and the phenomenal vocabulary. And that will be important when I wrap this up here too. Well, okay, so we have this consciousness, and it's interesting. Notice one thing that's interesting about it is it doesn't look like this qualitative experience is something that can be really captured in language, and that's a very significant thing indeed. If I was the poetry instructor, I might say, okay, everyone go home and write me a paragraph about what it is to see blue, say, and that would be a perfectly good poetry exercise. But what I wouldn't expect is to get something where someone who had never seen blue before, a colorblind person or someone like that, could actually just read that and then know what it was like to see blue, even though they'd never really actually had that experience. That I don't think is going to happen. So now the problem of consciousness, the problem here, folks, is not the problem that, hey, dude, I don't know what you're thinking, you don't know what I'm thinking. That's what people always think is going on in philosophy. But that's not the problem. I'm not worried about what you're thinking or feeling. If I'm worried about that, I'll ask you and you'll tell me. It's really not a philosophical problem. So what is the philosophical problem about consciousness then? Well, if I want to naturalize psychology, what's naturalizing psychology again? Remember, we have those words because we're not wizards, we're not Gandalf. We have these words, and so we want to look at those words and their concepts, right? I'm not sure what the difference is between words and concepts myself. And so we're thinking about what they are and how they work, and so we've got the psychological words in general, and then we've got those intentional words, belief, desires, and so on. We see that those are kind of funky. If we look at them as nouns and try to think about what they're referring to, it's kind of funky. But now we're talking about something else. We're talking about another set of words we also call psychological words. And those are these phenomenal or sensation words. So that's really what we're on about. We want to give, so the idea, or at least the object of the game, is to look at problems with giving a naturalistic account. Okay, a naturalistic account, all in natural language, all natural concepts, of the semantics, the meaning, reference of these phenomenal words, sensation words. So I'm going to go quickly through 4 different articles that are going to explain to us what is our project, what is our goal, what's the takeaway here. We just want to understand what the problem of phenomenal properties is, otherwise known as the problem of consciousness. And then we're going to look at how that's a problem for functionalism, which is very important. And then I'll just wrap that up with some maybe empiricist observations. So the first article that we want to look at is Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? From 1974. Echolocation in bats not even discovered until the 1950s, actually. But bats have a sense organ that most mammals don't have, although dolphins have a similar kind of organ. And it's like a sonar organ. It puts out blips and they bounce off of things and come back. So like someone on a submarine with a sonar, they can sort of detect large objects and how far away they are and stuff like that. The bats can do amazing things with this sense. I mean, this is like, you have your eyes and you can see with your eyes and hear with your ears. And, that's very rich, right? The input that you get from those sense organs is a lot. It's rich and intense. A lot of bandwidth, if you will, in your organs to your brain, right? Think about all the information and the visual input coming into your eye right now. So the bats have that, and they have it with another sense organ, echolocation sense organ. which they use, these bugs in the dark are going into their, danger avoidance subroutines once they know the bats are around and they're sort of randomly swirling around in the dark. And the bats are grabbing them out of the air. So there's really something that it's like to be a bat. We can't really get to that. I mean, we can imagine ourselves being bats, right? I can think about trying to be the Batman. Maybe I can wear some kind of device where I can start to get a sort of sense of how they navigate around. And that's kind of interesting. But no matter how much we know about the bat echolocation, we can study the bat echolocation organ all that we want to, but we're never going to know what it's like to be a bat. Again, the problem isn't, as I say, the Prepa Grateful Dead problem that, hey, dude, I don't know what it's like to be you. That's what everybody thinks in intro to philosophy, the philosophical problem is, no, that's not really the problem. I'm not really worried that the way you taste the spaghetti sauce is super different from the way that I taste the spaghetti sauce. It just doesn't strike me as a very serious philosophical problem. But it is interesting to think, see what Nagel's up to is he's thinking about consciousness or subjectivity. He likes to call it subjectivity as something that's in the world. And he's trying to figure out sort of how do we approach thinking about subjectivity. In my response to the problem of consciousness or phenomenal properties or subjectivity, if you will, is quite different from his. Let's look at another article. This is a book, Saul Kripke. It was a series of lectures that he gave. So think about reductive materialism, identity theory, right? And the idea might be that somebody might say, what pain really is C fibers firing, C fibers in the nervous system firing. That's why we call it identity theory, because that kind of reductive materialist wants to just identify the feeling of pain with the C fibers firing and say that they are one and the same. And Kripke's point here is about language and about the way that language works and about the way that naming works. Kripke, influenced by Wittgenstein, like a lot of the other people that we're looking at here. Maybe I'll just put the Wittgenstein video up there also for a supplemental. So at some point, pain has an origin. I mean, the word pain, we started using the word pain. We use the word pain to refer to that sensation, the sensation of pain. That's what the word, I feel a pain, right? That's what the word meant. What I'm trying to tell you is that I'm having that kind of mental experience, the sensory one, the phenomenal one of feeling the pain. Now, most folks, of course, to this day, I mean, of course, actually C fibers is just made up, but you get the idea. Most folks this day don't know that C fibers firing in the brain are what are causing pain. And, for most of human history, I guess people weren't even totally clear that the brain or the nervous system really had anything to do with pains particularly at all. So they were talking about pain, but they were definitely not talking about C fibers firing. And all this may seem like a parlor game. It actually is significant. Certainly from the point, again, remember, we're trying to think about it in terms of language here. So, I can certainly, I know the word pain, and I think I know what the word pain is, and what the word pain means, rather, and it means that feeling, the sensation of pain. And I can certainly think about that without thinking about C fibers firing. In fact, most of my life and most of the life of most people, that's exactly what we do. We think about pain and talk about pain, and we're not thinking or talking about C fibers firing, okay? So the word pain just does not refer to C fibers firing. It definitely refers to that sensation, the word, how it works. I mean, we could say, if we wanted to, we could say, okay, everybody, from now on, pain's going to mean C fibers firing. But that would be changing the use, the meaning of the word. The use and the meaning, the same thing, according to this is sort of the Wittgensteinian looking at language. But initially, I mean, Kripke's, the core simple point that Kripke's making is that initially, the word certainly referred to the sensation of pain, and it did not refer to C fibers firing. And again, that's not That's not as much a metaphysical point as it is a point about simply making sense and being coherent. John Searle, very famous. This is the Chinese room argument. You've probably heard of it. What is it? Let me just lay it out a little. I'm kind of assuming at this point you've seen it. I am going to post the video about Searle here as supplemental. So computational is very sort of arch, used to call it high church, right? Sort of cognitivism, which is the idea that really what minds all are computers executing programs, a la Turing, that idea sort of taken to its extreme. And Searle's goal in the Chinese room is to show that that's false. That's not true. That is, that human beings are not rule-governed symbol manipulating systems, right? A rule-governed symbol manipulating system. That's what a Turing machine is. It's got a couple rules, a couple simple rules that determine based on the state that the machine's in, what's the next state that it gets into. And the idea is given enough capacity, then it can execute any program. So then the computationalist says, well, maybe that's just what thinking is altogether. And even feeling, maybe that's just how nerve systems work. And Searle says no. Now, so what is it? So someone's in a room, and if you're a Chinese speaker outside of the room and you ask it a question like, what's the capital of France, and in Chinese, and you put it in a slot, you get out of another slot an answer in Chinese that's appropriate, that says Paris or whatever, answers the question correctly in Chinese. Yeah. So from outside, it certainly looks as if the Chinese room understands Chinese, because it responds to Chinese questions with appropriate Chinese answers. But the person inside the Chinese room, what they have is a whole bunch of Chinese characters, and they don't know Chinese at all. In fact, they don't even know that these characters, maybe they're just big cards that they have or something, and they have a chart. And it says, whenever you get a little squiggle sign like this, you put out a squoggle sign like that. With a squoggle sign, you put out the squiggle sign, and so on. They don't even need to know that those characters are symbols. They don't even need to have the concept of symbol. They don't need to know that's what's going on at all. All they need to do is follow the rule. That is, there's no reason that a formal rule-governed symbol manipulating system needs to have any idea of what it is that it's talking about, or even that it is talking about anything at all. But what would it mean to understand, to know that you were talking about something? Well, let's look at that third point on the slide there, cheese shop in Paris. A cheese shop in Paris. Now, what would it mean? Searle's insisting here, well, what is he? He said, look, you don't know what cheese shop in Paris is until you're able to somehow associate those symbols with real cheese that you've experienced. Maybe you've never been to Paris, but maybe you've had some really good cheese and you've seen movies and you've read about Paris. I've been to Paris. So when you say Paris to me, I mean, I think about, Galois cigarettes and people dressed all in black, and they don't like my blue jeans, but they have really good cheese. I mean, right? Having the actual experiences. And in that sense, when we tie meaning to understanding the qualitative experience like Searle does in the Chinese room, then we see that computers they don't have any kind of minds at all. They don't have any phenomenal experiences. By the way, I mean, maybe we'll talk about this more on this video. We can talk about it. It really looks like consciousness is kind of something more robotics is going to get at than computer science, I think, because it looks to me like me being conscious has to do with my body being covered with millions of nerve endings, and I have all these sense organs. Looks like it's about it being in this body, So, I mean, I think that's going to be more where consciousness comes from. And in the last bullet point, and then notice what his point is, and I do think this is right, that a computer in that sense is more like a rock than it is like a dog. It's like a magazine. It's a prosthetic to move information around. The dog is obviously having qualitative experiences, conscious experiences of its environment. And that makes it a lot like me and you. And there's nothing about the computer that's like that at all. I mean, not even on the road to that. as a matter of fact. What is on the road to that again in terms of artifacts? An artifact that's getting more and more sensitive and responsive to its environment. At what point do we start to say about an artifact that's sensitive and responsive to its environment, oh gee, I'm starting to worry about the quality of the experience of that artifact? I don't know. That looks like a threshold thing. All right, finally, now is this, I don't know if it's finally or not, that's Frank Jackson, What Mary Didn't Know. It is the last one of the four. So Mary is a color vision specialist. Mary is, in fact, the best color vision specialist in the world. Mary, it's a counterfactual, right? So she has the complete and correct physical description and explanation of color perception, which involves, as I say, a whole lot of scientific knowledge. She has to know about light waves outside of the body and how they behave and what they're made out of. She has to know about the retina at the back of the eyeball, which is measuring the frequency of the light waves and sorting it out into the spiky frequencies and the low frequencies and the reds and the blues. And then she has to know about the visual cortex in the brain. That's the back of the brain, I think. So, blah, blah. She knows, I don't know it, but Mary does. The complete and correct description, explanation of color perception, let's just say. Let's just say it's the final word. I mean, a human being can't know more about color perception than Mary does, and she's not got anything wrong. But here's the catch. Mary spent her whole life in a black and white room for some reason, in a black and white environment. So she's never seen color. She's completely got, why a black and white environment? Why not colorblind? Well, what we want is that she's actually got a body exactly like ours. So she's capable of any kind of knowledge that we're capable of. It's only that she's never experienced color. So she doesn't know what it's like to see color. And if that's true, that last bullet point on the slide there, I mean, Jackson's argument is really an argument with some real teeth, because if it's true that the complete and correct physical description and explanation of qualitative experience lacks some information, remember, it's complete and correct, there can't be anything added to it, then that means physicalism is wrong. I mean, after all, having a metaphysical position looks like it's got some implications. What do you mean by saying you're a naturalist or a physicalist? It's got to mean that what you mean is something like that we can do that we can explain this in natural terms. But according to Jackson's argument, that can't be done because Mary actually doesn't know something that is real information, the information about what it's like to see colors. So what's been the point of all that? The point of all that has been to get a handle on what phenomenal properties are. Phenomenal properties of conscious experience. Remember, non-physical properties don't just float around. There's got to be some non-physical thing that they attach to, and that would be qualitative experience. And you see again this problem. Okay, we've been talking about functionalism. Now, if you're not up on functionalism and supervenience, the deal is just basically that you could have a number of different beings who were all, say, rational, humans, aliens, dolphins, and so on. So functionalism, which isn't really a theory, functionalism just says, let's define mind functionally rather than physically so that it'll account for this interesting fact that rationality looks like it can be instantiated in multiple different physical things. So we have another video for that. And so functionalism looks pretty good that way. I mean, at least it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting concept to master, obviously very important. But consciousness is a problem for functionalism. And I want to talk about that because that's a big thesis of mine. I want to talk about the concepts, plural, of mind. So, all right, anyway. In what ways is consciousness a problem for functionalism? Again, functionalism just says, well, we want a functional description. But say I had a little wine identifying machine. It just had a little centrifuge in it, a little database. Spun the wine around, then it printed out what wine it was, the vintage and the vineyard and so on. And I was there with James Bond. And James Bond, you know, is a world-class wine connoisseur. And James Bond can sip the wine and tell you the vintage and the vineyard and all the rest of that stuff. Well, the functionalist looks like they're committed to the view that the little wine tasting robot, the little wine identifying robot machine, tastes wine equally as well as James Bond, the world-class wine connoisseur. And that seems completely wrong. That is, it doesn't look as if the little wine tasting device has any phenomenal experiences at all. It doesn't taste anything. So it looks like something's gone wrong for functionalism. If functionalism says, well, what it is to taste the wine is, say, for example, to be able to identify the wine, that doesn't look right. Or take somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't matter, saw reds where other people see blues and blues where other people saw reds. That is, their color spectrum was just inverted. But if they were born into it and grown all their life around other normal people, then neither they nor anyone else would know that their color spectrum was inverted. If you told them go out to the car and get the blue bag, he'd come back with exactly the same bag as everybody else. The fact that the experience that they were having was of a red bag wouldn't be anything. They would have no way of knowing that. They'd think that was what was called blue, and so would everybody else. So again, it looks like if you say, well, what it is to be able to perceive color is, for example, when I tell you to go get the blue bag, you bring the right bag back, then again, it looks as if the phenomenal experience is irrelevant. And that looks wrong. We think the phenomenal experience is like the most important thing in life, in case you haven't noticed. It looks like any function, catching a ball, anything, even maybe just acting like a person. So there's a whole, I don't think this is right, by the way, but there's a whole literature that maybe there just could be, why couldn't there just be zombies, that functional equivalents of human beings that had no conscious experiences at all? So that's the way the consciousness is a problem for functionalism. Now, again, what's my response to that? Does it somehow defeat functionalism? Functionalism not necessarily defeasible, since it's not really a theory, it's just a way of describing things versus a physical way of describing things. But there's been certainly a lot of back and forth for many decades between the sort of phenomenologists, that is, people who say the consciousness is a problem, and maybe sort of operationalists or other people who say, no, it's not. Looks to me like mind is a heterogeneous concept. It looks as if we've got two different sets of psychological words, the intentional and the phenomenal. And it looks like some kind of functionalist approach is going to be what we need to deal with intentional attributions, belief, desire attributions to intentional beings. But I think we're going to need a whole other way of handling consciousness. We have a whole other vocabulary for that. We think we have one mind, and mind is one thing because we have one body, but that's just because we haven't analyzed the concept of mind right. There are two things that we mean by mind. That's what I think. So anyway, that's the idea, right? I mean, in other words, there isn't actually an argument between the people who think that phenomenal experience is important and the people who, I don't know what, don't think it is, something. Actually, no, rather they're just cross-talking, because really, if you want to deal with intentional, rational beings, you're going to have to talk about that in an operational way, because that is definitely supervenient, multiply realizable. Whereas on the other hand, if you're talking about conscious experience, it's just not that, that's not true. I have every reason to think that a being with a body altogether different from mine is having quite very different experiences. Again, I'm not worried that I have no way of knowing what you think. That's not a philosophical problem, or how you feel. I can ask you, you can tell me. That's not it. We're opaque to each other. That's bong hit philosophy. No, that's not it. The problem, again, is the problem about naturalizing. Now, notice that reductive materialism cannot handle rationality or mathematics in general at all, but it can handle sort of tasting spaghetti. That is, well, if you ask, why does spaghetti taste like that? Well, because I have the kind of body that I do. It interacts with those molecules that way, and it's contingent. Remember, my mathematical logical thinking is all necessary, but it's only contingent to my body being this body, that blue surface looks like that to me, or that rose smells like that to me, right? So, all right. in general, and this is a little, I mean, this is a deep issue. I'm just having this little video about it. So I'm just going to go over this slide fairly quickly and then, but just trying to say something about it as an empiricist. I think there is a tradition. Berkeley and Hume, remember Berkeley putting it pretty interestingly well when he says, look, you see, you say there's this internal mental and there's this external physical, and you're not sure about the connection between the two, but the only thing that you actually experience is this thing you're calling the internal mental, your own representation of the world. And if that's so, and all you know is, and he's an empiricist, why do we say Berkeley, the idealist, is an empiricist? Because he, with Hume, he agrees with Hume that knowledge is based on experience. And so why don't you just say that everything's mental and get rid of that supposed external physical world that you can't, that according to you, you can't experience directly. And that's kind of a good response to skepticism, right? It's the empiricist response sort of to skepticism. And Wittgenstein is in the line with Berkeley and Hume on this. And I think we do find arguments like this in some areas of Buddhism as well. As I say, there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm not going to go into that now. The idea, here's an interesting thing to think about, though, that we should try and think about is, you know, you've got you, and then you've got the external world, but then there's sort of your experience of the external world. And so there's a sense in which you and your experience of the external world and you, let's say, both sort of collapse into experience. Right. I mean, you're not, you can't sort out you from the external world anymore when you start thinking about your experiences, which are your life after all. So that's the sense in which, you know, experience constitutive of the world. Berkeley and Hume think that when you talk about the external world, what you're actually talking about is the set of all of your conscious experiences. There's a nominalist view of what the externalist world is. And as I say, I'll share that Wittgenstein with you. So, okay. So main goal to understand what consciousness is, see how consciousness looks like a problem for naturalization. If after that you're still not exactly sure, you might be thinking too hard, but take another look at those articles that I went over, and you know, you can look at one and see if you can grab the argument out of it and understand it. That would be good. That would be a good week's work. Anyway, I will give you good links to all of those, and then we've really actually got all of the problems kind of out, and we'll do some other stuff. Alrighty then, but I am looking forward to looking at consciousness. There's a lot to say about it. Okay, I think that's all I have to say. Okay. Bye-bye, and enjoy some nice hors d'oeuvres. Don't say au revoir, just say